Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Today we ascertain the truth about critical questions that are still unanswered. What was the actual role that Donald Trump and Marco Rubio played in obtaining the India-Pakistan ceasefire? How do Americans respond to the Indian Foreign Secretary's claim that the ceasefire was bilaterally arranged after the Indian Prime Minister claimed Pakistan's DGMO promised to stop acts of terror? In the process, have India and Pakistan ended up re-hyphenated? Has Kashmir been internationalized? And could India's new doctrine of deterrence make another war inevitable? To discuss these issues, I'm joined live from Washington, D.C. by the South Asia columnist of Foreign Policy magazine, Michael Kugelman. Michael Kugelman, let me start with the obvious question. On 8 separate occasions, President Trump has claimed that either he mediated or sure as hell helped settle the problem. So let me ask, what sort of role did he, Marco Rubio, and the Trump administration play? Was it mediation? Was it facilitation? Or did they just knock heads together?
Yeah, well, thanks. It's great to be back here with you. Thanks for having me. I think first of all, we need to accept that there's a lot that we still do not know. In even my own conversations with U.S. officials, it's difficult to get a true sense as to what happened, given the sensitivities of this and so on. But several broad points I'll put out there to start this conversation. One, as you know, there is a precedent, a historical precedent of the U.S. Intervening diplomatically during India-Pakistan military crises. It happened in 2019. It's happened on a number of other occasions, 2001, 2002, and of course, in Kargil in 1999. Now, in this case, we know that from the very start of this crisis, there was U.S. messaging. There was significant levels of U.S. public messaging, and of course, it began after the terror attack in Kashmir, when you had many senior officials across the board in Washington condemning the attack and expressing solidarity with India and so on. Then we saw a pattern as the crisis became more serious and as it became an actual military crisis, calls for de-escalation from the State Department. There was certainly some inconsistencies, as you know, in terms of the messaging. And we had J.D. Vance go from telling Prime Minister Modi that the U.S. would provide all assistance to help India in the joint fight against counterterrorism, to saying in an interview that the U.S. was not going to get involved in other people's wars. But here I'll hone in on what I think is an essential point. The State Department was always very consistent in its messaging, in calling for de-escalation. Almost every day during the crisis, there was a press briefing, and the State Department spokesperson said that we're not watching this from afar. We're very closely engaged. And we know that Secretary of State Rubio spoke at least twice with his counterparts in India and in Pakistan before the push for the ceasefire began. Now, in terms of the actual ceasefire, what role the U.S. had in it, my sense is that the president might have overstated the exact role that the U.S. had in it, but I think it's very clear that as the escalation dynamics played out, and it became clear that this was becoming a very serious crisis in terms of the intensification of hostilities, the US was inclined to step up its game, so to speak, and mainly the State Department, I mean, step up its game in terms of urging each side to look toward off ramps and a ceasefire. But I have no reason to think that the U.S. was directly involved in the actual talks between India and Pakistan that resulted in the ceasefire.
So it sounds to me as if you're saying that there was definitely American involvement, maybe even some form of intervention. They were pushing both sides to agree to ceasefire, but to call it mediation may be going one step too far.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly my point. And again, I mean, if you look at how things are developing in the days leading up to the ceasefire, the Secretary of State was in touch with his counterparts. So I think that already you could already look at that as some type of even of indirect mediation. The fact that the senior official of the State Department, the senior most U.S. diplomat, was talking to his counterparts in India and Pakistan multiple times with this message of de-escalation. I think that's an indication right there of where things were going.
Now, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has also claimed that India and Pakistan have agreed to start talks on a broad set of issues at a neutral site. This is, as you know, precisely what Pakistan wants, but it's equally precisely what India is opposed to. Do you see this as an inadvertent error made out of inexperience? Because he's only been Secretary of State for about 4 months. Or is Rubio deliberately leaning towards Pakistan?
Yeah, this is one of the puzzles to emerge from this story in terms of the U.S. role, and I would argue that Rubio, of all these officials that we could talk about, J.D. Vance, President Trump, Rubio, and others, I think Rubio has the best instincts. He's very knowledgeable about India-Pakistan dynamics. He's just a very savvy, knowledgeable guy. I mean, we saw this when he was on Capitol Hill. I think that he understands this very complex situation on the subcontinent better than other cabinet level officials. And in that regard, it's somewhat surprising that it would be him that would come out with this tweet or this post saying that there'd been an agreement to have these talks. Again, I don't know the full story. I suspect that something was misunderstood or misperceived at some point, at some process in the chain of communication. Because no, I do not think that either Marco Rubio or anyone else in the U.S. administration would want to be seen as explicitly backing the Pakistanis. Though indeed, that's exactly how this looks. And if you combine that with Trump's comment about Kashmir, which I'm sure we'll get to, it certainly looks like that. But something must have been lost in translation somewhere, because clearly the U.S. would not want to be seen as pushing for something that India would be seemingly directly opposed to and that Pakistan would be enthusiastically backing.
Let's come to Trump's comments about Kashmir. Twice he said they've been fighting for centuries. On one occasion, he said it's a 1,000-year-old war. But he also said that he believed that they would be able to sort it out themselves. His words were, they'll figure it out one way or the other. Does that mean that he's equated the two as sort of equal partners in problems?
Right. I mean, as we could agree, I mean, many of the public statements that Trump gave during this crisis, in fact, most of them, appeared to engage in the hyphenization that U.S. policy has stayed away from for several decades now. Now, I would make a point that I think might seem obvious, but is still important to amplify. These comments that Trump was making, the ones that you cited and others, should not be seen as reflecting U.S. policy, right? I mean, these are, as I understand it, off the cuff remarks made by a president who certainly knows about India and Pakistan, but is not someone who would necessarily understand the policy context and the very complex dynamics between these two and the story of de-hyphenization in U.S. policy and all of that. I think this is someone who knew that there was a serious crisis playing out between India and Pakistan, and he was very intrigued by the intractability of this Kashmir issue, and thought that maybe it seems intriguing as something that he would want to look into, so to speak. But this is just him speaking off the cuff, so to speak. Now, his earlier comments about how the two sides will have to figure it out themselves, it was not clear to me if that was a reference to the crisis of the moment or if it was a reference more broadly to the Kashmir issue. It could have been a reference to both. I think it was more so a reference of the crisis. If so, that clearly shows a level of inconsistency, given that later on he clearly supported the idea of a U.S. push, and he claimed credit for a U.S. push that led to the ceasefire. But this inconsistency in messaging, that's something we've seen a lot of times before with him and with others in this administration.
Michael, it's not just inconsistency, it moves close to becoming intriguing because, as you pointed out, President Trump's initial position was they'll get it figured out one way or the other. Vice President Vance's position was we're not going to get involved in the middle of a war that's fundamentally none of our business. How then did America get involved in a round-the-clock effort to broker a ceasefire? Because that happened very suddenly, and then it happened very intensely.
I think speaking of the Vance comments, I think this could be a reflection of someone who is very knowledgeable, very savvy on many issues, including foreign policy, but might not have or at that time when he made these comments, might not have had that context to understand where things might go. I mean, this is someone who might not have recognized that, given past precedent with India and Pakistan, and given the precedents of 2016 and 2019, that we'd seen exponential levels of escalation, and suggesting that this crisis could escalate more than any other crisis had escalated before, since the two countries became formal nuclear states. And in that sense, he simply changed course. He changed his mind. He changed his messaging. He changed his views about what the U.S. should do once it became clear that hostilities were escalating to a significant level. When he made the comments, I guess it was to Fox News, about how the U.S. won't get involved in other people's wars, this is something that doesn't relate to the U.S. At that point, the crisis had not become what it did, on that May 9th, that late May 9th period leading into May 10th, when the ceasefire came about. So I think it was a matter of just shifting position once there was a recognition as to how serious things had become. And again, when Vance was making the comment about the U.S. not wanting to get involved in other people's wars, the State Department at that point was saying something very different. It was saying that we're engaged, we're talking, we're not watching this from the outside. Again, I think suggesting a level of understanding of the broader state of play that you might not have had with others in the administration. And again, my understanding is that Secretary Rubio was really leading the U.S. efforts until the very end, when the vice president got involved as well.
Let me ask you pointedly about Secretary Rubio. At the moment, he's not just Secretary of State, he's also the National Security Advisor. So how critical was his role, and how much authority did his combined roles actually give him?
Well, I think that's very significant. That's an important point, that he does wear both of those hats. That means that, clearly, the State Department was leading on the diplomatic effort from the outside, but other actors were clearly involved as well, including the White House and presumably the National Security Council. And so that would give Rubio a significant amount of authority over the interagency dynamic in the U.S. It would also give him authority to engage with a wider variety of stakeholders in India and in Pakistan. Now, I don't know the exact nature of engagement that Rubio had with key stakeholders in India and Pakistan. We know that he was in touch with the two foreign ministers several times. We don't know about others, but you look at the dynamics. We know that in Pakistan, the relatively new national security advisor is someone that that would be important to talk to, so to speak, given who it is. And so Rubio would have that authority as the national security advisor. So yeah, this is very significant. And I think it gave him more authority, as perceived by Washington and by New Delhi and Islamabad, to talk with a wider range of actors during this crisis.
Let me put the flip side to you. The Indian Foreign Secretary has told the Parliamentary Select Committee, and I believe it was yesterday, that the ceasefire was bilaterally arranged. He absolutely insisted upon that, and that there was no US involvement. Earlier, the Indian Prime Minister, in a speech to the country, said that the ceasefire had happened because the Pakistani Director General of Military Operations had rung, promising to stop acts of terror. Many people wonder whether the Pakistani DGMO is even authorized to say that, but that is what the Indian Prime Minister said. How do you respond to these claims from the Indian side, which are very different to what the Trump administration has been saying?
Yeah, so as I said before, I think there's reason to believe that President Trump and indeed perhaps others overstated the role here. I mean, the way that President Trump has described it, or the way that he initially described it, was that the U.S. was essentially mediating the entire process, getting to the ceasefire, negotiating the ceasefire, getting the two sides to finalize the ceasefire. And I don't think that's the case. As I said, I think this is a case of the U.S. as things were getting more escalatory, pushing the two sides to focus on off ramps, and the two sides took it from there, so to speak. But there's another important point here that I think your question leads into. My sense, and my apologies if this comes across as a bit provocative, though I guess provocative can be good. Given where things were going at that period, late Friday, the May 9th, leading into the early hours of May 10th, things were bad in the sense that tensions were soaring, bilateral tensions were soaring, the use of force, the hostilities were escalating to levels we hadn't seen in decades. But I would argue that at that point, both sides, India and Pakistan, could have both, from their respective perspectives, concluded that it might be okay to look for off ramps at that point. And happy to go into why I think that. But if that's the case, then in that sense, the Trump administration, would not have had to do that much to essentially get the two sides to look to this idea of pushing for a ceasefire. And so what I've said, and I think others have said this as well, is that the Trump administration might have been pushing at an open door, right? In the sense that you already had a level of readiness, I would think, particularly from the Pakistani side, but I think from the Indian side too, to look toward wrapping things up, declaring victory, taking a story of victory to its respective publics, and then moving on from there.
Tell me, as you view the situation now, how seriously re-hyphenated have India and Pakistan become? How internationalized has Kashmir become? Both of those are outcomes that India would deeply regret and not want. So this is why I ask you, how seriously are they re-hyphenated? How seriously is Kashmir internationalized?
Well, I mean, I guess from a rhetorical level, Kashmir has been internationalized because President Trump, clearly one of the most powerful figures on earth, publicly said that it's time to seek a solution. So I think on a rhetorical level that internationalizes it. But I think only if the U.S. were to follow up Trump's comment with an actual policy, could we talk about it being internationalized on a more substantive level. And I think it's highly, highly unlikely that the Trump administration would follow through on that. And indeed, you note that no one in the Trump administration has said anything about Kashmir publicly since Trump's comments. And as you know, the U.S. position for quite some time has been to essentially defer to the Indian position, that it's not something for the U.S. to wade into. I think that will remain the case here. In terms of the hyphenization and all of that, I really think that we're going to revert to the norm fairly soon. I mean, it looks like now, given the things that Trump has said, and given the Rubio comment about talks at a neutral site, it does seem that the U.S.-India relationship has taken a hit because of this apparent hyphenization. That the U.S.-Pakistan relationship has gotten a boost, but I think that things will revert to the norm. At the end of the day, there are so many strategic, commercial, other imperatives for the US and India to really come back to where things were before this crisis began, which was to pursue a pretty significant partnership. The Trump administration might not describe it as a strategic one. It doesn't like to look at partnerships as strategic. Everything's transactional. But I think that this administration would recognize that that's where things have to go. And with Pakistan, the US will have limited goals in Pakistan: critical minerals, limited cooperation on counterterrorism, which obviously is not going to go down well in India. But my point is that these comments in recent weeks, my point is that these comments that President Trump has made in recent days, we shouldn't overstate the impact that'll have on US policy.
There is also cryptocurrency, which is much reported in the Indian papers, which is a deal that apparently the Pakistan government has done with close allies and friends of the Trump family.
Yes, right, exactly. And I think that we'd seen Pakistan very explicitly say that they are making efforts to legalize cryptocurrency and set up a new crypto council chaired by the finance minister. this has been explicitly described by Islamabad as something that they're doing because they know that President Trump is interested in crypto. They have not been, they've been very open about this. But again, crypto, I mean, this is not going to be something that's going to become a pillar of a new, significant substantive partnership between the US and Pakistan. Trump has his eyes on the critical minerals in Pakistan. That's clear. And there was a senior official that went to that recent mineral summit in Pakistan. But this was happening before this crisis, this India crisis took place.
The other concern in Indian eyes is that President Trump's tweets and comments have helped ensure that the narrative is about the nuclear threat in Kashmir. It's not about terror. Do you believe that once again that plays to Pakistan's advantage and to India's apparent discomfort?
Absolutely, this is a critical issue. I mean, this conflict that played out. It was a conflict that played out on the battlefield, so to speak, but it also has played out in terms of narratives. And you've got this battle of narratives that's intensified since the military crisis ended, and now it's being taken abroad. I mean, of course, as you know, both India and Pakistan have announced these very senior delegations to go around the world. India doing more globetrotting than Pakistan, I think, in this case, but they both want to tell their story. So yes, to your question, India is at a disadvantage in the sense that when this crisis began, the world was essentially rallying to India's side, condemning the terrorist attack in Kashmir, expressing solidarity with India. I mean, even the Chinese right away, their ambassador in India, publicly stated, offered, condemned the attack and so on. But as the crisis went on, as it became a military crisis, and as the world became concerned about escalation and nuclear escalation risks, that's where India started to lose out. Because indeed, I mean, you don't hear governments, you didn't hear governments during the last days of the crisis bringing attention to the terrorist attack that precipitated the entire crisis. The focus was on the need to de-escalate because of concerns about escalation leading to nuclear escalation risks. And I think I suspect that's one reason why India has decided to put together this delegation to travel the world and essentially remind the international community about what it was that started this whole very scary crisis.
Now, Michael Kugelman, Prime Minister Modi has said that India's Operation Syndhur is only paused, it's still by no means over. And to go one step further, the Indian Defense Minister says Pakistan is on probation. So, how does Washington view the present situation between India and Pakistan if Operation Syndhur is to be the new normal?
Well, I think that this crisis, this conflict was a bit of a wake-up call to the Trump administration. This is an administration that has acknowledged, and I've been in conversations where I've heard officials indicate this, that South Asia and more broadly the Indo-Pacific is not necessarily going to be an immediate priority for the US during these early months of the Trump administration. The focus is going to be on trying to end wars in the Middle East and Ukraine, and also focus on foreign policy issues closer to home, suggesting that, once this administration has more sea legs, once we get later into the year, the focus will return to Asia. But clearly, I mean, this crisis made it very clear that you can't really overlook South Asia either. So what I'm saying is that I do think this administration has moved on for the most part now that the crisis is over, now that the ceasefire is in effect. I have heard some messaging from Washington that there's going to be efforts to try to ensure that the ceasefire remains in effect. But I think that it might be difficult to think that this administration will be fixated on this ongoing confrontation. And it still is a confrontation. It's not a conflict anymore, it's a confrontation, given everything else that the administration has on its plate. But I do think that, given the messaging we heard from your prime minister and from the Pakistani officials, Pakistani prime minister, the speeches that were given on both sides, these are pretty maximalist positions that do not suggest any desire for conciliation. And indeed, Prime Minister Modi saying that, what's the ceasefire is temporary. I mean, any ceasefire is by definition supposed to be temporary, not permanent. But the implication from the prime minister was that that this could resume at any time. And clearly, if there is an attack, another attack in India, one could expect some type of very prompt response. So, yeah, I mean, it's very concerning moving forward. But I do think that the main focus on the Indian and the Pakistani sides in the coming days and weeks will be on the narrative side, and that's why I think there's going to be a lot of attention focused on these delegations traveling the world to put forward their position on the issue.
Let me make it even sharper and clearer for you. India has said that it will view every act of terror as a declaration of war. And that means that the key question from the Indian point of view is, has Operation Syndhur deterred Pakistan? Will LET and Jaish be reined in, or do you believe there will be more attacks of terror in the not too distant future? And I'll add that Hussein Haqqani, a former Pakistani ambassador to Washington, told me on Monday that Operation Syndhur will increase the resolve of the terrorists.
Right. Yeah, I saw that interview. No, I think this is certainly something to be concerned about. I mean, if you're pushed against the wall and you're feeling a lot of pressure, I mean, if you have that capacity to continue to hit out, then you will. And so, indeed, I mean, my sense is that what India is trying to do here is maybe to an extent raise the costs for Pakistan of continuing to sponsor these anti-India terrorists and actors. But it might also be meant to ensure that, assuming these attacks continue to happen, and unfortunately there's no reason to think they won't, that India would be better prepared to degrade the threat over time posed by these terrorists. But you look at, if we take the attention away from the kinetic action and the terrorism, as you know, India has undertaken a number of measures in recent days, and that includes suspending the Indus Waters Treaty. Now, if you go back a number of years, Lashkar-e-Taiba has in the past threatened to attack India by citing quote unquote Indian water theft, right? And this was some years ago. I haven't heard that messaging as much in more recent years. But now that India has held the treaty in abeyance, putting it in a position where it could do things that will really upset Pakistan, that would suggest that perhaps LET and its ilk would have more of a pretext and a reason to try to threaten attacks in India because of what India has actually done in terms of pulling out of the treaty. I'm just speculating here, but my main point is that with this particular issue of water relations, the terrorists might be further emboldened by what India has done in terms of pulling out of this treaty.
You're speculating about how terrorists could be emboldened to respond or react to India's threat to shut off the waters. Let me put the focus the other way around. Now, India can't divert or stop the flow of water immediately because it simply doesn't have the infrastructure to do so, and it will take years, maybe even a decade, for that infrastructure to be built. But what India can do, and is threatening to do, is to deny Pakistan hydrological data, which could be critical both with the onset of the monsoons just weeks away or with the Kharif sowing season coming on. And secondly, India can also interfere with what's called the predictability of the flow of water. And just a couple of days ago, the Indian Express has claimed that India will flush the Salal and Baglihar dams on the Chenab every month. And if it does that, that will certainly affect the flow of water. Now, certainly, I know that Pakistan won't like this. They will be extremely upset and angry. But my question is, how would the Trump administration, the only other government in the world that matters, respond to this behavior?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think here this gets to issues of capacity and bandwidth. It's one thing for the Trump administration to mobilize on an interagency level when there's concerns about nuclear escalation risks in South Asia. But when it comes to a water treaty, I think it, quite frankly, might be difficult to get the attention of enough folks at the senior levels to actually come up with some type of approach to deal with this issue. Keeping in mind that there are still a number of empty posts in the administration focused on South Asia, including perhaps most significantly, the senior South Asia official at that state. That's still, we have, someone, of course, has been nominated but not confirmed, that being Paul Kapoor. And so, that suggests that it could be difficult to get the attention in a big way of the administration. Yeah, I think that you would need those who are actually aware of the very details that you described, aware of just how significant a threat this could be for Pakistan's economy and so on, not necessarily over the longer term, but some of those steps that you mentioned that could be taken in the immediate term, that could have an impact on Pakistani agricultural production to an extent. But again, given everything that this administration has on its plate, given the stated priorities it has on a foreign policy level, I think that issues of India exploiting a water treaty, it's not going to register as high on the radar of concern in Washington as concerns about a possible nuclear war. I mean, just to be very candid, but absolutely, I think that this deserves the attention, more attention from the Trump administration for sure.
Tell me, against this background, let's focus for a moment on the new doctrine of deterrence that Prime Minister Modi announced last week. It has three key elements. India will respond decisively to any act of terror. It will not submit to nuclear blackmail, and it will not distinguish between terrorists and governments that sponsor and shield and protect them. How would that doctrine be viewed in Washington?
I think it would be viewed as something potentially escalatory, for sure. But I think also this comes back to some of the issues that we were talking about earlier about how the U.S. has perceived the recent crisis and how those views changed. I think that you have so many. I mean, this administration is firmly behind India on this idea of being threatened by cross-border terrorism in Pakistan. I mean, this administration, the current one and the previous Trump administration, take a very strong position on the issue of Islamist terrorism, and so that puts it, in the same position as India, of course. So, in that sense, I think that there would be sympathy to this idea that India has essentially stated that from here on out, if there is a terrorist attack in India, it's going to respond swiftly, definitively, making that clear. So I think that would get sympathy and support from many in the Trump administration. But I think the broader implications of that type of policy and the fact that that could suggest, connote a level of escalation, and then whenever the next crisis comes around, and it will come around eventually, that you could have even more escalation than you had in this most recent one. So I think that's where you would have concern from the administration. I'm not sure to what extent there have been engagements between U.S. and Indian officials on this very issue. I doubt there have been any. I mean, right now, as you know, the big focus of the bilateral relationship are the trade talks, which were playing out, and the Indian Commerce Minister had been in Washington the last few days. That's going to be the focus. But I think at this point, it's something that will be discussed on an interagency level in Washington. I don't think that we would expect the U.S. to take an actual position on that. But it's something that certainly was taken note of by those in Washington that focus on this part of the world.
Now, in that interview that you also saw, Hussein Haqqani made a very strange admission, or at least I should add, a very strange admission from an Indian point of view. He said, and I'm quoting him, even if Pakistan today decides to shut out these groups, there will be some groups that will still act. How do you interpret that? Does it suggest that Pakistan is unable to stop and control the terror emanating from its territory?
Well, it's tough to know, for sure. I mean, I think that one could argue that in more recent years, Pakistan has sought to put a tighter leash on some of these groups that it used to take a more hands-off role with. I mean, if you look at how things played out in Kashmir at the height of the insurgency in the 90s, I think that you had pretty clear levels of encouragement from the Pakistanis to for their assets to do certain things. But I think because of international pressure and the FATF phenomenon and all of that, Pakistan has sought to keep a bit of a tighter leash on these entities, but that does not rule out the possibility that indeed you do have these violent actors that enjoy a level of autonomy and that they can't be controlled. I think that if you look at the broader Pakistani policy toward terrorists of different ilks in Pakistan, it's a case of playing with fire, because we know that there have been a number of terrorists, including fairly senior terrorists, that are at one point members of groups that are sponsored by, patronized by Pakistan, and then they jump ship to groups that are anti-Pakistan, that stage attacks in Pakistan. There have been a number of cases of this. So in that sense, I think that it would be inaccurate to suggest that if Pakistan essentially shuts down every vestige of the terrorist infrastructure in Pakistan, that there's not going to be any further threats of terrorism emanating from Pakistan into India. I mean, I think that might be oversimplified to say that, but at the end of the day, I think it's a very difficult point to get into definitively.
Let me end, Michael Kugelman, by going back to the Pahalgam terror attack, which started this whole crisis. It's exactly a month since it happened. Does the Trump administration today accept that this was the work of Pakistan-based terrorists, possibly even with the connivance of the Pakistan ISI, or does it believe India needs to make better evidence available? Which of the two?
Yeah, to be honest, I can't say. I mean, I've not seen any type of position taken by the administration on this, and even in private conversations have not yielded any indication as to what the U.S. thinks. I think that from the U.S. perspective, the concern was, at least initially, less who was behind the attack and more so what happened after that, and the need to focus on crisis management and so on. But we know that the U.S. does share India's view that cross-border terrorism emanating from Pakistan continues to be a concern, a real concern. And if you look at the high-level engagements between the U.S. and India during the early period of this Trump administration, this is highlighted. When Modi was in Washington for the meeting with Trump, you look at the joint statement, there was that mention of cross-border terrorism and specifically citing LET and Jaish-e-Mohammed. I mean, this has been a stock. We've seen this in every joint statement coming out of a U.S.-India high-level engagement for years, really since the Mumbai attacks, quite frankly, in 2008. So that I think that the U.S. will continue to be sympathetic to Indian claims of Pakistani involvement in an attack like this, but indeed, I think that the fact that India has not provided evidence publicly of a Pakistani role, I mean, that is significant. But again, I think at the end of the day, for the administration, the focus is less so initially on what prompted this, who has perpetrated this, and more on the need to do what the U.S. can to help manage the crisis before it gets out of hand.
In the context of the answer you've just given me, how do you read the nature of the international support India has received? How do you read the fact that the BRICS, the G7, the G20, the EU, the UK, the USA, and arguably even Russia, a very close ally of India, did not call out Pakistan by name? They condemned terror, but they were fairly conspicuously silent about Pakistan's alleged involvement, which was the entire point from the Indian point of view.
Well, here, going back to what I said, the issue of the lack of evidence that's been put out there, at least in the public domain, right? I mean, I think it may be more difficult for these countries to come out and condemn Pakistan if there is no clear evidence put out there in the public domain. Now, I know that the Indian government has said a number of things. It said that the Resistance Front, the group that initially claimed the attack before rescinding the claim, is a proxy of or linked to Lashkar-e-Taiba in some way. But you could argue about why this happened, but that group renounced the earlier claim attributed to it. So my view is that perhaps the international community does not feel inclined or comfortable to condemn Pakistan, given that you don't have that clear level of complicity put out there by the Indian government, at least not publicly. But again, I go back to something I said earlier. Yeah, as this crisis became more escalatory and serious, I think that for much of the world, the focus was not on the terrorist attack that prompted the crisis, but more so the fears about nuclear escalation. I mean, no one wants that, for sure. No one wants that risk to emerge. And that might be another reason why you didn't have a desire to push Pakistan. There's a desire to not appear to be imbalanced or biased toward one country or the other at a moment when the international community wanted its its comments, its calls to be focused on de-escalation and getting each side to heed those calls for de-escalation.
One quick thought before I thank you and say bye-bye. How telling is it that the New York Times reported that when the Indian Foreign Secretary was briefing G20 ambassadors, some of them, but they were never named, actually told the New York Times that India's case was based upon what had happened in the past as an indication of what might have happened this time, but not on more solid information or evidence. How telling do you think that comment might have been?
Well, it's very telling. It goes back to what I said before, right? I mean, if the view of these foreign leaders is that India is not necessarily does not have concrete evidence to point to and is looking at past patterns and historical precedent, which of course is very strong in terms of Pakistani complicity in these types of things, then that might be a reason. But no, I think that's very significant. And this again, I think, shows the importance of this delegation of Indian figures that's going to be going around the world to push its case. I suspect that it's going to want to push back against that whole idea that, oh, because there's no evidence that's been provided, it's not fair to blame Pakistan. I suspect India is going to want to push hard against that. Who knows if this delegation will have evidence to share? I'm not necessarily sure that would be the time when that would come to bear. But again, I think the importance of this battle of narratives that's going to be playing out in the coming days and weeks is something we should not underplay. It's going to be a pretty big deal.
Michael Kugelman, thank you very much for the time you've given me. Thank you very much for sharing your analysis with us. Take care. Stay safe.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.